The mountain village of Thornwick had seen strange visitors before, but never one like Homo sapiens. Standing in Farmer Aldrich's musty barn, surrounded by healthy, strong donkey foals, the cloaked figure ignored them all. Instead, his weathered hands reached for Ember, a sickly, trembling runt that barely stood on wobbling legs. The villagers whispered he was mad. What they didn't know was that Homo sapiens carried the blood of the ancient beast whisperers, a forgotten lineage that could see the true nature hidden within creatures. While others saw weakness in Ember's frail body, he saw something extraordinary burning in those dark eyes, a spark that hadn't appeared in 1,000 years. The village blacksmith laughed. The mayor shook his head in disgust. Even Farmer Aldrich felt embarrassed by the choice. But within days, impossible things began happening. Ember's transformation defied everything they thought they knew about nature itself. The stranger's selection would either save their dying village from an approaching darkness or destroy everything they'd built. What ancient power had Homo sapiens recognized in the weakest creature alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Thornwick's cobblestones like a shroud as Homo sapiens emerged from Aldrich's barn, the pitiful donkey foal stumbling behind him on a frayed rope lead. The stranger's face remained hidden beneath his hood, but his movements carried the confidence of someone who had walked countless paths between worlds. 20 silver pieces for that bag of bones. Gareth the blacksmith spat into the dirt, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. I wouldn't pay 20 copper for that walking corpse. Aldrich shifted uncomfortably, the coins jingling in his weathered palm. He'd expected to haggle over his prized foals, the strong-backed bay or the spirited chestnut. Instead, this peculiar traveller had pointed directly at Ember, the runt he'd been planning to put out of its misery before winter's bite. "The stranger's coin spends the same," Aldrich muttered, though uncertainty clouded his eyes as he watched Ember struggle to keep pace with Homo sapiens' measured stride. Mayor Thorne pushed through the gathering crowd, his silk vest straining over his considerable belly. "Now see here, traveller, that animal won't survive the mountain passes. Surely you'd prefer one of our heartier specimens?" Homo sapiens paused, turning his hooded face toward the mayor. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ancient stones. "Strength is not always what it appears to be, Mayor Thorne. Sometimes the mightiest river springs from the smallest crack in the mountain." The crowd murmured uneasily. There was something in the stranger's tone that made their skin prickle, as if his words carried power beyond mere meaning. Young Elena, the baker's daughter, knelt beside Ember as the procession halted. The foal's ribs showed clearly through its dull coat, and its breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts. "Poor little thing," she whispered, reaching out to stroke its velvet nose. "Why would anyone choose you?" As her fingers made contact with Ember's muzzle, a strange warmth pulsed through her palm. For the briefest moment, she could have sworn she saw golden light flickering behind the donkey's dark eyes, a flame that burned with impossible intensity. "Did you feel that?" she gasped, looking up at Homo sapiens. The stranger's hood shifted, and Elena caught a glimpse of eyes so ancient they seemed to hold the memory of stars. "You have the sight, young one. Guard it well. Few in this age can perceive what lies beneath the surface." Before Elena could ask what he meant, Homo sapiens gently tugged Ember's lead and continued toward the village outskirts. The crowd followed at a distance, drawn by curiosity and an inexplicable sense that they were witnessing something momentous. At the village well, the stranger stopped and drew water in a wooden bucket. As he lowered it for Ember to drink, he placed his other hand on the foal's forehead and whispered words in a language that predated the village by centuries. The air around them shimmered like heat waves, and several onlookers rubbed their eyes, convinced they were seeing things. Ember drank deeply, and color seemed to return to its dull coat. Its breathing steadied, and for the first time since its birth, the little donkey lifted its head with something approaching dignity. "Impossible," breathed Aldrich. "Merely the beginning," Homo sapiens replied. He straightened, his cloak billowing in a wind that touched no one else. This village stands at a crossroads, though you know it not. Dark times approach from the northern wastes, times that will test every soul in Thornwick. The shadow blight spreads southward, consuming all in its path. Your village lies directly in its root. Homo Sapiens's voice carried grim certainty. But hope walks on four legs among you now, if you have the wisdom to nurture it. He looked down at Ember, who had grown steady on its feet, then back at the assembled villagers. 3 days I will remain. In that time, you will learn whether your faith lies in appearances or in possibilities. The stranger's weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness as he knelt beside the trembling foal. Dust motes danced in the morning light that filtered through the stable's broken slats, casting shifting patterns across his sun-darkened face. The donkey's mother watched nervously from her stall, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of protective instinct and bewildered acceptance. "What do you see in that pathetic creature?" Margot's voice cut through the silence like a rusty blade. The village baker had followed them into the stable, her flour-dusted apron a stark contrast to the shadows around them. "Look at him. He can barely stand upright." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed one palm against the foal's forehead, just between those oversized ears that seemed to catch every whisper of wind. For a moment, something flickered in the animal's eyes, not the dull resignation that had marked his short existence, but something deeper, older. Then it was gone, leaving only the familiar vacancy. "Every legend begins with doubt," the stranger finally said, his voice carrying the weight of countless years. "The greatest heroes are often those the world has forgotten to notice." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "This one will need a name." "Names are for creatures worth remembering," muttered Henrik from the stable doorway. The stablemaster's resentment was palpable. Losing even his most worthless animal meant one less beast to sell, however meager the price might have been. The stranger reached into his travel-worn pouch and withdrew a small leather purse. The coins within clinked softly as he tossed it to Henrik, who caught it with practiced ease. The stablemaster's eyes widened as he felt the weight, far more than any reasonable price for the pitiful foal. "Asterion," the stranger pronounced, the name rolling off his tongue like an incantation. "He shall be called Asterion." The foal's ears twitched at the sound, and for the briefest instant his head lifted with something approaching dignity. Several onlookers gasped. They had never seen the creature display even that much spirit. "That's a mighty grand name for such a sorry beast," commented Willem, the village blacksmith. His massive arms were crossed over his barrel chest, skepticism etched into every line of his soot-stained face. "Sounds like something out of the old tales my grandmother used to tell." "Perhaps because it is." The stranger's smile held secrets. "Stories have power, Willem Ironright, more power than most people dare to believe." A chill ran through the gathered crowd at the casual mention of Willem's family name, a name the blacksmith had never shared with this mysterious visitor. Whispers began to circulate, nervous glances exchanged like currency in an unstable market. Young Petra pushed forward through the crowd, her curiosity overcoming her mother's restraining hand. At 7 years old, she possessed the fearless wonder that age and disappointment had not yet dampened. "Can I pet him, mister? He looks lonely." The stranger nodded, and Petra approached the foal with the confident gentleness that children seemed to possess instinctively. As her small hand touched Asterion's neck, the donkey leaned into the contact, the first voluntary interaction anyone could remember him initiating. "He likes you," Petra announced, with the matter-of-fact tone children used for obvious truths. "I think he's been waiting for someone to be kind to him." "Wisdom often comes from unexpected sources," the stranger observed, watching the girl and the foal with evident approval. "Perhaps Asterion isn't the only one in this village who has been underestimated." Petra's mother, Elena, stepped forward to reclaim her daughter, but something in the stranger's eyes gave her pause. "You speak as if you know things about us, about our village. I know that your well runs deeper than it should, given the drought in neighboring regions." His gaze swept across the assembled faces. I know that your crops have flourished despite soil that should be barren. I know that children born here are healthier, live longer than those in settlements twice as prosperous. He paused, letting the implications settle. Did you think such blessings came without purpose? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. These were observations that touched on half-acknowledged mysteries, the kind of fortunate coincidences that people preferred not to examine too closely for fear of disturbing whatever benevolent forces might be responsible. What are you saying? Elena's voice barely rose above a whisper. I'm saying that some places are chosen, just as some creatures are chosen. The stranger turned his attention back to Asterion, who now stood with marginally more steadiness, as if Petra's gentle touch had awakened something dormant in his spindly legs. Your village sits at the convergence of old paths, old powers. It has been waiting. Waiting for what? The question came from multiple voices, a chorus of mounting anxiety. The stranger lifted Asterion's lead rope, preparing to depart. For someone worthy to awaken what sleeps beneath. Someone who understands that true strength often wears the mask of weakness and that legends are born not from perfection, but from the courage to become more than what the world expects. With that cryptic pronouncement, he led the stumbling foal toward the village outskirts, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with questions that would haunt their dreams for nights to come. The stranger's weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness as he knelt beside the trembling foal. Kyle watched from the shadows of the stable doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The old man's fingers traced patterns in the air above the donkey's matted coat, and for a moment the boy could have sworn he saw threads of silver light dancing between those ancient fingertips. What are you doing to her? Kyle whispered, unable to contain himself any longer. The stranger's eyes found his without surprise, as if he had known all along that someone was watching. Awakening what was always there, young keeper. Come closer. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Kyle stepped forward. The foal's breathing had steadied, though she still lay on her side in the straw. Up close, he could see that her coat wasn't the dull brown he had always thought it was. Beneath the grime and neglect, there were hints of something else, a shimmer that seemed to shift between bronze and gold in the lamplight. She's dying, Kyle said flatly. Has been since she was born. Nothing you do will change that. Dying. The stranger rolled the word around his mouth like he was tasting wine. Perhaps, or perhaps, she is simply waiting for permission to live. His hand settled on the foal's neck, and she lifted her head for the first time in days. Her dark eyes, which had been clouded with pain, suddenly seemed impossibly deep. The stable door creaked behind them. Kyle spun around to find his father, Master Jorik, standing in the entrance with 3 other village elders. Their faces bore expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. "Step away from the boy," Master Jorik commanded. His blacksmith's muscles tensed for action. "Whatever game you're playing, stranger, it ends now." The old man rose slowly, his joints protesting with audible pops. "No game, Master Jorik. Though I understand your caution. It has been many generations since one of my kind walked openly among your people." "Your kind?" Elder Marta pushed forward, her grey hair wild from running. "What exactly are you claiming to be? Some sort of hedge wizard? A travelling charlatan looking to fleece honest folk?" The stranger smiled, and Kyle noticed that his teeth were perfectly white despite his apparent age. "I am what your ancestors would have called a pathmaker. We were the ones who helped forge the first bonds between human and beast, back when the world was younger and magic flowed as freely as mountain streams." Master Jorik snorted. "Fairy tales and nonsense. Magic died out centuries ago, if it ever existed at all." "Did it?" The stranger gestured toward the foal, who was now struggling to stand on unsteady legs. "Then explain to me how a creature that couldn't lift its head an hour ago is now attempting to rise." The gathered adults fell silent, staring at the impossible sight. The foal's legs shook violently, but she managed to get her front hooves under her body. Her eyes never left the stranger's face, as if drawing strength from his presence alone. "Tricks," Elder Harron muttered. but his voice lacked conviction. "Sleight of hand." "You're welcome to believe that," the stranger replied mildly, "but belief won't change what's happening here. This foal carries bloodlines older than your village, older than your kingdom. She is descended from the great carriers who once bore heroes across impossible distances and into legend itself." Kyle stared at the pitiful creature, trying so desperately to stand. The idea that she could be connected to anything legendary seemed absurd. She was small, sickly, and had been rejected even by her own mother. Yet something in her eyes had changed. The dullness was gone, replaced by a fierce determination that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Even if what you're saying were true," Master Jorik said carefully, "what does it matter? Look at her. She's barely alive." "She's alive enough." The stranger knelt again as the foal's back legs finally found their footing. She stood, swaying in the straw, but she stood. The question now is whether she'll have someone to guide her through what comes next. His gaze shifted to Kyle, and the boy felt the weight of that ancient stare like a physical thing. The bond between pathmaker and carrier is not something that can be forced. It must be chosen by both parties. But there are other bonds that can form, bonds between keeper and kept that can grow just as strong. "You're talking about Kyle," Master Jorik said, stepping protectively in front of his son. "He's just a boy. So were most of the great riders when they began." The stranger's smile was gentle but unyielding. "The foal has already chosen him, Master Jorik. She has been choosing him since the day she was born. The only question is whether he has the courage to choose her in return." All eyes turned to Kyle, and he felt the crushing weight of a decision that would change everything. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones as Elias led the foal through the village square, drawing stares and whispered conversations from early risers. The creature's uneven gait echoed off the stone walls, each step a reminder of its twisted leg and uncertain future. Yet something had changed since their encounter the previous evening. The foal walked with its head higher, no longer cowering at every shadow or sound. Marta emerged from the bakery, flour dusting her apron, and paused to watch them pass. "Strange sight, that," she murmured to her neighbor. "Never seen the beast walk with such purpose." Elias heard the comment but offered no response. His weathered hands remained gentle on the lead rope as they made their way toward the forest path that wound up into the hills. The foal needed space away from prying eyes, somewhere the ancient energies could work without interference from doubt and skepticism. As they climbed higher, the village sounds faded behind them, replaced by birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine branches. The foal's breathing grew labored, but it pressed on without complaint, as if understanding that this journey held significance beyond a simple morning walk. They reached a clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. Elias had discovered this place decades ago during his own period of wandering, drawn by the subtle thrum of power that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. Ancient stones, worn smooth by countless seasons, formed a rough circle at the clearing's heart. "Here," Elias said softly, bringing the foal to the center of the circle. "This is where your true education begins." The foal's ears twitched, and for a moment its eyes seemed to catch and hold the dancing light. Elias knelt beside the creature, placing both hands on its neck. The touch was warm, but gradually something deeper stirred beneath his palms, a current of energy that flowed between them like water finding its course. "Listen carefully, little one," Elias whispered. "What I'm about to share has been passed down through generations, kept alive by those who understood its value. You carry within you the bloodline of Aethon, the Windwalker, the Starborn. Your ancestors soared above mountains and crossed oceans on wings of pure light." The words seemed to resonate in the clearing, as if the stones themselves remembered such tales. The foal stood perfectly still, its breathing slow and deep, while around them the forest held its breath. Elias closed his eyes and reached deeper into the well of knowledge he carried. Images flowed through his mind, magnificent creatures with coats that shimmered like starlight, their hooves barely touching the ground as they ran. He had seen them only in visions passed down by his predecessor, an old woman who had found him half dead in a snowbank 40 years ago, and taught him the ways of the gift. "The power sleeps," he continued, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality, "but it does not die. It waits for the right moment, the proper awakening. Your body may be weak now, but your spirit carries the memory of flight." As he spoke, warmth spread from his hands into the foal's body. The creature shuddered, not with pain, but with something approaching recognition. Deep in its amber eyes, a spark flickered, brief as lightning, but unmistakable. A rustling in the underbrush broke the moment's intensity. Elias looked up to see young Thomas peering through the trees, his face flushed from the climb. The boy stepped into the clearing with obvious reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with the scene before him. "My father sent me," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wants to know what you're doing with the foal." Elias studied the boy for a long moment. Thomas was perhaps 16, caught between childhood wonder and adult skepticism. His eyes held curiosity despite his apparent discomfort. "What do you see, Thomas?" Elias asked, instead of answering the question. The boy shifted nervously, glancing between Elias and the foal. I see an old man and a lame donkey in the woods. Look deeper." Thomas frowned but obeyed, focusing his attention on the foal. Seconds passed in silence. Then his expression changed, confusion replacing certainty. "There's something different, the way the light catches its coat, and its eyes." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Trust what you see," Elias encouraged. "Your generation has grown up dismissing anything that doesn't fit neat explanations. But some truths are larger than human understanding." The foal took a tentative step toward Thomas, moving with less difficulty than usual. The boy instinctively reached out his hand, and when the creature nuzzled his palm, Thomas gasped. "It's warm," he said in wonder. "Not just warm. It's like touching summer lightning." Elias smiled, recognizing the moment when belief began to crack through doubt's armor. "Now you begin to understand why this foal is precious beyond measure." The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Elara made her way to the stable, a worn leather satchel bouncing against her hip with each hurried step. Word had spread quickly through the narrow streets about the stranger's peculiar choice, and curious villagers had begun gathering in small clusters, their whispered conversations following her like persistent flies. She pushed open the stable door, expecting to find Kai tending to the animals as he did every morning. Instead, she discovered the mysterious stranger kneeling beside the pitiful donkey foal, his weathered hands moving in slow, deliberate patterns above the creature's trembling form. The air around them seemed to shimmer with an almost imperceptible warmth. "You're early," the stranger said without looking up, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from the previous day. "I couldn't sleep." Elara stepped closer, noting how the foal's breathing had become more regular, less labored. "What are you doing to him?" "Nothing he cannot handle." The stranger's hands paused, hovering inches above the foal's spine. "Tell me, child, what do you know of the old stories?" Elara frowned, unsure of his meaning. "Which stories?" "The ones your grandmother whispered when the fires burned low and the wind carried voices from forgotten times." His eyes met hers, and she felt that same unsettling sensation of being truly seen. Stories of the starborn. The word sent an unexpected chill through her bones. She had heard that term before, buried deep in half-remembered lullabies and her grandmother's rambling tales of heroes who rode beasts of legend across skies painted with starlight. But those were just stories, weren't they? "My grandmother had many stories," she said carefully. "Most were nonsense." The stranger smiled, an expression both sad and knowing. The wisest truths often sound like nonsense to those who aren't ready to hear them. He returned his attention to the foal, whose dark eyes now seemed more alert, more aware. "This little one carries something precious within him, a spark that has waited generations to be awakened." As if responding to his words, the foal struggled to his feet with surprising grace. Where yesterday he had been all awkward angles and trembling limbs, today he stood with a dignity that seemed impossible for such a small, plain creature. "I don't understand," Ilara whispered. "Understanding comes with time." The stranger rose, brushing hay from his robes. "What matters now is trust. Can you trust that some things exist beyond the boundaries of what you've been taught to believe?" Before Ilara could answer, the stable door burst open, and Kai stumbled inside, his face flushed from running. Behind him came old Henrik, the village smith, and several other men whose expressions ranged from curious to hostile. "There you are," Henrik wheezed, pointing an accusing finger at the stranger. "Thought you could hide in here, did you? Playing tricks on honest folk?" The stranger remained perfectly calm. "What troubles you, Henrik the smith?" "Don't you troubles me, conjurer. My tools moved in the night. Heavy anvils shifted like they weighed nothing. Strange lights dancing in my forge when the fire was cold." Henrik's voice rose with each word. "That's witch work, that is." "Perhaps," the stranger replied mildly. "Your tools were preparing themselves for the work to come." This response only inflamed Henrik further. "Speak plainly, you mad fool." "Magic is returning to this world," the stranger said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the stable. "The barriers that have held it at bay for 3 centuries are weakening. What you experienced was merely the beginning." Nervous laughter erupted from some of the villagers, but Ilara noticed that Kai had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the stranger with an intensity that made her stomach clench. "Magic is dead," Henrik declared. "Has been since the Sundering Wars. Everyone knows that." "Magic never dies," the stranger corrected gently. "It sleeps, it waits, and sometimes, when the need is great enough, it chooses humble vessels through which to return." His gaze moved to the donkey Foal, who stood watching the exchange with an intelligence that seemed far too keen for such a young animal. "You're saying that creature is magical?" Henrik's voice cracked with disbelief. "I'm saying he will be." The stranger moved to the foal's side, placing one hand on the small grey neck. "As will others, in time. The old bloodlines stir. The ancient pacts remember themselves." The foal turned his head toward Ilara then, and she gasped. For just a moment, his ordinary brown eyes seemed to hold depths of starlight, infinite and ancient and impossibly wise. Then he was just a donkey foal again, nuzzling her outstretched hand with velvet lips. "The choosing has begun," the stranger continued, his voice growing distant. "And this village stands at the center of something that will reshape everything you think you know about your world." In the silence that followed, Ilara could hear her heart hammering against her ribs, and she wondered if her life would ever feel normal again. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Ilara made her way to the pasture, her heart heavy with doubt. 3 days had passed since the stranger's arrival, and still no sign of the transformation he had promised. The other villagers whispered behind cupped hands, their skepticism growing bolder with each sunrise that revealed nothing more than a scrawny donkey foal stumbling through the grass. Bramble stood apart from the other animals, as always, his coat still patchy and dull, despite Ilara's careful tending. She approached slowly, carrying a bucket of fresh oats mixed with the healing herbs the stranger had left behind. The foal's ears twitched at her approach, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw something different in his eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before. "What did that old man see in you?" she whispered, setting down the bucket. Bramble nuzzled her palm, his touch gentler than usual, almost reverent. "The whole village thinks we're fools, you know." As if summoned by her words, voices carried across the morning air. Mayor Aldrich's booming tone rose above the others as he led a small group toward the pasture. Behind him walked Gareth the blacksmith, old Henrik the grain merchant, and several other prominent villagers, their faces set with purpose. "Ilara!" Aldrich called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to discuss this situation." She straightened, instinctively moving closer to Bramble. The foal seemed to sense her tension, pressing against her side with surprising steadiness. "What situation would that be, Mayor?" "This foolishness with the donkey," Gareth interjected, his massive arms crossed over his chest. It's been 3 days, girl. 3 days of wasted time and resources on a creature that should have been put out of its misery months ago. Henrik nodded vigorously, his thin frame bobbing like a reed in the wind. The stranger filled your head with nonsense, child. There's nothing special about this animal. Look at it. Weak, pathetic, a drain on our community. Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Bramble stepped forward. The movement was subtle, but there was something different about his posture, straighter, more confident. The foal's dark eyes fixed on the group of men, and for a heartbeat, an uncomfortable silence fell over them. "See how it glares at us?" Henrik muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Unnatural, that look." Mayor Aldrich cleared his throat, his political instincts taking over. "Elara, we've all known you since you were small. You're a good girl, responsible, practical. This isn't like you, clinging to fairy tales and wild promises." "What if they're not fairy tales?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "What if there really is something special about him?" The stranger knew things, about our village, about the old legends. He spoke of the Hearthkeeper as if he had actually seen. "Enough!" Aldrich's voice cracked like a whip. "The Hearthkeeper is a children's story, nothing more. We've humored this long enough. The animal needs to be sold or disposed of. We can't afford to waste resources on sentiment." Bramble snorted, a sound that seemed almost like laughter, and pawed the ground with his small hooves. Where they struck the earth, Elara noticed something odd. The grass beneath looked greener, more vibrant. She blinked, wondering if her desperate hope was making her see things that weren't there. Gareth stepped closer, his intention clear. "Come along, beast. Time to end this charade." What happened next would be talked about in hushed whispers for years to come. As Gareth reached out his calloused hand, Bramble reared up on his hind legs. But this wasn't the clumsy, unsteady movement they had all grown accustomed to. The foal moved with sudden grace, his small frame somehow commanding attention. For just an instant, as the morning sun broke through the clouds, his shadow fell across the ground in a shape that made no sense, larger, more majestic, with what looked impossibly like wings spread wide. The men stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock. Henrik's mouth worked soundlessly, while Gareth's outstretched hand trembled in the air. "Did you see?" Mayor Aldrich began, then stopped, shaking his head as if to clear it. "No, tricks of the light, nothing more." But Elara had seen it too, and more importantly, she had felt it, a warmth that spread from Bramble through her own chest, like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. The foal settled back onto all four legs, once again appearing small and unremarkable, but the moment had changed everything. "One more day," she said quietly, her voice carrying new conviction. "Give us one more day." The men exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence shaken. Even Gareth seemed reluctant to approach the foal again. Finally, Mayor Aldrich nodded curtly. "One day, Elara. But if nothing changes by tomorrow's dawn, this ends." He turned away, the others following, their whispered conversations urgent and confused. Alone again with Bramble, Elara knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his neck. Something was stirring, she was certain now, something that would change everything. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Elara made her way through the village streets. 3 days had passed since the stranger's departure, and the whispers had only grown louder. She clutched the leather pouch he had given her, its weight somehow both reassuring and terrifying against her palm. Behind her, Stumble's hoofbeats created an oddly rhythmic melody on the cobblestones. The little donkey had changed since that night in the grove, not in any way the villagers could see, but Elara felt it. There was a steadiness to his gait now, a quiet confidence that hadn't existed before. When she looked into his dark eyes, she sometimes glimpsed something ancient, a knowing that made her breath catch. "Morning, Elara." Thorn the blacksmith emerged from his forge, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron. His greeting was polite enough, but she noticed how his gaze lingered on Stumble and how his fingers unconsciously traced a protective ward against his chest. "Good morning, Master Thorn." She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered. The pouch seemed to pulse with warmth. As she continued toward the market square, more eyes followed her passage. Goodwife Maren swept her doorstep with unnecessary vigor, stealing glances over her shoulder. Young Tom Fletcher actually crossed the street to avoid walking too close to stumble, his face pale with poorly concealed fear. Fear. That's what she saw everywhere now. The stranger had spoken of legends and ancient bloodlines, but he hadn't warned her about this. The way her own neighbors would look at her as if she'd become something foreign and dangerous overnight. There she goes again, talking to that creature like it's people. The voice drifted from the baker's stall, deliberately loud enough for her to hear. "Mark my words," came the reply. "No good will come of this business. Strangers bearing gifts always bring trouble." Ilara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The market square opened before her, bustling with its usual morning commerce, yet she felt the subtle shift in the crowd's movement. Conversations dimmed as she passed. Vendors who had known her since childhood now served her with forced smiles and hurried transactions. She was purchasing oats from Master Aldwin when the real trouble began. 50 copper pieces for that bag of oats? The merchant's price was nearly double the usual rate. "But Master Aldwin, last week you charged 25 for the same amount." His weathered face hardened. "That was before you brought complications to our village. Strange happenings follow strange beasts, girl. I've got my own family to think about." Heat flashed through Ilara's chest, and for a moment the pouch in her hand grew almost too hot to hold. Behind her, Stumble snorted softly, and she could have sworn she heard something like distant thunder in the sound. "I see." She counted out the coins with deliberate calm, though her hands trembled slightly. "Thank you for your honesty, Master Aldwin." As she turned to leave, a commotion erupted near the well. Young Bess, Goodwife Maren's daughter, had apparently fallen while drawing water. She sat on the ground, clutching her ankle and weeping. Several villagers clustered around her, but none seemed to know what to do. Without thinking, Ilara hurried forward. "Let me help." Goodwife Maren stepped protectively in front of her daughter. "You've done enough already. Keep that thing away from my child." The circle of villagers parted, leaving Ilara standing alone with Stumble in the center of their collective mistrust. She felt their eyes like physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. The whispers started again, more urgent now. "Ever since that night in the forest, unnatural, I tell you, should never have trusted." "Enough!" Elder Matthias's voice cut through the muttering like a blade. The village leader stepped into the circle, his gnarled walking stick tapping against the cobblestones, his ancient eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, fixed on Ilara's face. "You will all return to your business," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "This child has done nothing but care for a creature that needed caring. If that troubles your sleep, perhaps you should examine your own hearts more closely." The crowd reluctantly dispersed, though Ilara caught the dark looks thrown over shoulders and the hurried protective gestures made when they thought she wasn't watching. Elder Matthias approached slowly, studying both girl and donkey with careful attention. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. "The stranger left more than gifts, didn't he? He left responsibilities. It wasn't really a question." Ilara nodded, not trusting her voice. "The old stories speak of times when legends wake," the elder continued thoughtfully. "Such times are never easy for those who must live them, but they are necessary all the same." He placed a surprisingly steady hand on her shoulder. "Whatever comes, child, remember that wisdom often wears the guise of foolishness, and that the greatest magic often chooses the most unlikely vessels." With that cryptic comfort he walked away, leaving Ilara to wonder if she truly understood what she had accepted that night beneath the ancient oaks. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones as Kyle led Ember through the village square, their footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn silence. The foal's breathing had grown labored during the night, and despite the stranger's reassurances, doubt gnawed at the boy's heart like a persistent hunger. "Where are we going?" Kyle whispered, though no one was awake to hear them. Theron emerged from the shadows near the old well, his weathered cloak billowing in the cool breeze, to a place where the old magic still remembers its purpose. His eyes held that familiar intensity, but something else flickered there, urgency that hadn't been present before. They walked beyond the village boundaries, past the wheat fields where Kyle had spent countless hours dreaming of adventure. The path wound upward through stands of ancient oaks, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that filtered the strengthening daylight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. Ember stumbled twice, her legs trembling with each step. Kyle's throat tightened as he steadied her, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his palm. "She's getting worse." "The awakening is never gentle," Theron said without slowing his pace. "Power demands sacrifice, and transformation requires the breaking of what came before." The words offered little comfort. Kyle had grown attached to the small creature, flaws and all. The thought of losing her to some mystical process he barely understood made his stomach churn. They crested a hill and descended into a hidden valley that Kyle had never seen before, despite years of exploring these woods. At its center stood a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air itself felt different here, thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "The Heartstone Circle," Theron announced, his voice carrying a reverence that bordered on worship. "Here, the barrier between what is and what could be grows thin." Ember's legs gave out as they reached the circle's edge. She collapsed onto the soft grass, her breathing shallow and rapid. Kyle dropped to his knees beside her, running his hands along her neck in a futile attempt to provide comfort. "Is she dying?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Theron knelt on the foal's other side, placing his palms against her flanks. The symbols on the stones began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that matched Ember's labored breathing. "Not dying, child. Being reborn." The stranger's hands emanated warmth, and the light from the stones grew brighter. Kyle watched in fascination as thin streams of luminescence began flowing from each stone toward Ember's prone form. The energy pooled around her like liquid starlight, seeping through her coat and skin. "The bloodline of the celestial mounts has lain dormant for 3 centuries, Theron explained, his voice strained with concentration. "What you see is weakness, her fragility, her inability to thrive. These are the signs of power trying to emerge from a vessel unprepared to contain it." Ember's body convulsed, and Kyle instinctively reached out to steady her. The moment his skin made contact, the flowing energy changed course, some of it passing through the foal and into him. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, simultaneously burning and cooling, lifting him while anchoring him to the earth. Images flooded his mind, vast armies marching beneath banners that bore the symbol of a winged horse, riders mounted on creatures of legend soaring above mountain peaks, a great darkness spreading across the land while points of brilliant light pushed back against its advance. In each vision, he saw the same bond, human and mount united by something far deeper than mere partnership. "The connection forms," Theron observed, though his words seemed to come from a great distance. "You feel it now, don't you? The link that your ancestors knew." Kyle nodded, unable to speak. The visions continued, showing him glimpses of a war that had raged long before his birth, of heroes who had ridden their celestial partners into battles that determined the fate of kingdoms. He saw the gradual fading of the bloodline as peace settled over the land and the need for such bonds diminished. But now something stirred in the shadows of those peaceful years. He caught fragments of a new threat rising, ancient and patient, waiting for the world to forget the old ways before making its move. Ember's breathing steadied, and the frantic pace of her heartbeat slowed to something more natural. The energy streaming from the stones began to fade, though Kyle could still feel its warmth flowing between them, a connection that he somehow knew would never fully disappear. The foal's eyes opened, and for a moment they glowed with the same ethereal light as the stones. She struggled to her feet, steadier now than she'd ever been, and nuzzled against Kyle's shoulder with newfound strength. "It has begun," Theron said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "The first bond in 300 years. The dawn mist clung to the village like a shroud as Kyle emerged from his cottage, the leather satchel containing the heart of Athros secured beneath his cloak. Sleep had eluded him through the night, his mind churning with the weight of what lay ahead. The ancient relic pulsed with a warmth that seemed to echo his own heartbeat, a constant reminder of the choice that would soon transform everything. Lyra waited by the old oak at the village's edge, her small frame silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Beside her stood the foal, no longer the pitiful creature he had first encountered weeks ago. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Where once there had been weakness, now there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself. Her coat, though still bearing the scars of early neglect, held a luster that caught the filtered sunlight. Most remarkably, her eyes burned with an intelligence that seemed far beyond her years. "She's been restless all morning," Lyra said as Kyle approached, "almost like she knows something important is about to happen." Kyle nodded, studying the foal with careful eyes. The bloodline of the ancient guardians ran through her veins. He was certain of it now. The signs were all there for those who knew how to look, the particular arch of her neck, the way her hooves seemed to barely touch the ground when she moved, and most tellingly, the mark on her forehead that grew more distinct with each passing day. What had once appeared to be merely an oddly shaped patch of hair now clearly resembled the symbol he had seen carved into the walls of forgotten temples. "Has anyone else noticed the changes in her?" Kyle asked, his voice low. Lyra glanced toward the village center, where early risers were beginning their daily routines. Old Henrik mentioned yesterday that she seemed different, and Martha said something about her eyes being too knowing for a simple farm animal, but most people are too busy with their own troubles to pay much attention to a donkey foal. That would change soon enough. Kyle reached into his satchel, his fingers closing around the heart of Athros. The crystal felt alive beneath his touch, its surface warm and somehow responsive to his presence. According to the ancient texts, the bonding ritual had to be performed at the moment when day and night stood in perfect balance, and today marked the autumn equinox. The foal stepped closer, nuzzling against Kyle's free hand with surprising gentleness. He felt a jolt of connection, as if she somehow understood the magnitude of what was about to occur. Perhaps she did. The blood of the guardians carried with it an instinctual knowledge that ran deeper than conscious thought. "Tell me again why it has to be her," Lyra said, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Over the past weeks, Kyle had shared fragments of the old stories with her, carefully chosen pieces that prepared her without revealing too much too quickly. "Because she was born for this purpose," Kyle replied. "Just as the first guardian was chosen not for their strength or beauty, but for their pure heart and untainted spirit. The ancient magic recognizes its own, regardless of the form it takes." A commotion from the village square interrupted their conversation. Raised voices carried on the morning air, angry shouts mixed with what sounded like fear. Kyle's blood ran cold as he recognized some of the words being bandied about. Stranger, unnatural, darkness following. "They're talking about you," Lyra whispered, her face pale. "Some of the villagers met last night. They think you've brought some kind of curse to the village. The crop blight, the strange dreams people have been having, the way animals have been acting nervous, they're blaming you for all of it." Kyle closed his eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over him like a familiar cloak. This too had happened before, in other villages, in other times. Fear always preceded understanding, and transformation never came without resistance. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Not long. They were talking about confronting you this morning, demanding answers." Lyra's hand found the foal's neck, her fingers tangling in the coarse mane. "What will you tell them?" The truth was impossible. They wouldn't understand, wouldn't believe. But lies would only make things worse when the reality of what was coming finally revealed itself. Kyle looked at the foal, seeing past her humble exterior to the magnificent being she would become. The village might reject him, might drive him away, but they could not stop what had already been set in motion. "We perform the ritual now," he said, pulling the heart of Athros from his satchel. The crystal blazed within a fire as it met the morning light, casting prismatic reflections across the grass. "Whatever comes after, she will be ready." The foal lifted her head, staring directly at the ancient relic, and for just a moment, Kyle could have sworn he saw wings of pure light shimmer behind her shoulders. The first tremor rippled through the ground at dawn, subtle enough that most dismissed it as a passing cart or restless livestock. Kyle felt it differently, a resonance that seemed to echo in his bones, calling to something deep within the ancient bloodline he carried. He found himself at Ember's side before fully awakening, his hand resting on the young donkey's neck as another pulse of energy coursed through the earth. Ember's eyes had changed overnight. Where once they held simple animal awareness, now they gleamed with an intelligence that made Kyle's breath catch. The foal stood taller, his coat rippling with an inner light that seemed to flow like liquid starfire beneath the surface. When their gazes met, Kyle heard something impossible, a voice, clear as mountain water, speaking directly into his mind. "The awakening comes," Ember's thoughts whispered. "Can you feel them stirring?" Before Kyle could respond, screams erupted from the village center. He rushed toward the commotion, Ember keeping pace beside him with a grace that defied his humble origins. What they found sent ice through Kyle's veins. The old well had cracked open, revealing not water, but a yawning chasm that breathed forth shadows with malevolent purpose. The darkness writhed upward like smoke, but it moved with intention, reaching toward the terrified villagers who scrambled backward from its touch. Where the shadows brushed against wooden posts or stone walls, the materials withered and crumbled as if aged 1,000 years in moments. "The veil weakens," Kyle breathed, understanding flooding through him as inherited memories sparked to life. The barriers between worlds grow thin. Elder Thorn appeared at his shoulder, her face pale but determined. "How long do we have?" "Not long enough." Kyle watched as more fissures spiderwebbed outward from the well, each one releasing tendrils of that consuming darkness. "The village needs to evacuate. Get everyone to the high meadows, away from any stone or deep earth. What about you?" Kyle looked down at Ember, whose coat now pulsed with steady rhythm like a heartbeat made of light. "We have work to do." As Thorn rallied the villagers, Kyle led Ember toward the spreading corruption. The young donkey showed no fear, his steps sure and purposeful. With each stride, the light beneath his coat grew brighter, pushing back the encroaching shadows by mere inches. "Tell me what I need to do," Kyle projected the thought, still marveling at this impossible connection. "Our trust," came Ember's simple reply. "And remember who you are." The words unlocked something within Kyle's chest, a warmth that spread outward through his limbs, carrying with it knowledge that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. He was more than just a wandering stranger with mysterious gifts. He was a guardian, one of an ancient line tasked with maintaining the balance between worlds. The magic in his blood recognized its purpose at last. He raised his hands, and silver light poured forth, weaving itself into protective barriers around the fleeing villagers. But the effort cost him, and he could feel his strength ebbing even as more cracks appeared in the earth. That's when Ember stepped forward. The transformation was breathtaking. Light erupted from the small donkey's form, not harsh but warm and encompassing, like sunrise after the longest night. His humble frame stretched and shifted, muscles strengthening, limbs lengthening, until he stood magnificent and proud, not quite horse, not quite the simple creature he'd appeared to be, but something altogether more wondrous. Twin spirals of horn emerged from his forehead, carved from what looked like crystallized moonlight. His mane flowed like captured aurora, and when he stepped toward the largest fissure, flowers bloomed in his hoofprints, despite the corruption all round. A unicorn, Kyle realized, wonder stealing his breath. The last unicorn. Ember's transformed presence began to heal the wounded earth. Where his light touched the spreading darkness, it didn't simply push it back, it transformed it, converting shadow into rich soil, malevolence into growing things. The largest crack started to seal itself, the dangerous chasm becoming fertile ground. But the effort was enormous. Kyle could see Ember trembling with strain, his magnificent form flickering as if he might collapse back into his original shape at any moment. Without hesitation, Kyle stepped forward and placed both hands on the unicorn's neck, pouring his own guardian magic into the healing process. Together, they wove light and life into the wounded world. The remaining fissures sealed themselves one by one, the last tendrils of shadow dissolving into harmless wisps. As the danger passed, Ember's form began to shimmer and fade back toward his humble donkey appearance. "Not yet," Kyle urged, maintaining the connection between them. "They need to see. They need to understand what they're protecting now." As the villagers crept back from the high meadows, they found their mysterious stranger standing beside a creature from legend itself, both glowing with fading magic in the morning sun. The sight would be burned into their memories forever, the moment their simple world expanded to encompass wonders beyond imagination. The real adventure was only beginning. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Kyle led Ember through the ancient stone archway that marked the entrance to the Whispering Gorge. The donkey's hooves echoed against the weathered stones, each step resonating with an otherworldly harmony that made the old man's spine tingle. Behind them, the village had already begun to fade into memory, though Kyle could still feel the weight of 100 curious eyes following their departure. Ember moved with newfound confidence, his once awkward gait now purposeful and sure. The silver markings along his flanks seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, casting dancing shadows on the narrow path ahead. Where once there had been a pitiful, stumbling creature, now walked something that defied easy explanation, part earthly beast, part living embodiment of legend. "The Codex spoke of 3 trials," Kyle murmured, more to himself than to his companion. "The trial of earth, the trial of spirit, and the trial of flame. Each one designed to test not just power, but understanding." The path began to descend sharply, carved into the living rock by hands long dead. Ancient symbols lined the walls, their meanings lost to all but the most learned scholars. Kyle recognized some, warnings, blessings, and fragments of the old tongue that spoke of sacrifice and transformation. The air grew thick with an energy that made his weathered hands tremble. As they rounded a sharp bend, the gorge opened into a vast circular chamber carved from black stone. At its center stood a pillar of white marble, untouched by age or weather, upon which rested an ornate bronze chalice. The cup seemed to draw light from the very air around it, casting everything in a warm golden glow. "The trial of earth," Kyle whispered, recognizing the setup from his studies. "It tests the bond between creature and world, between the chosen one and the very foundations of existence." Ember approached the pillar without hesitation, his silver markings now blazing within a fire. As his hooves touched the base of the marble column, the ground beneath them began to tremble, not with violence, but with something deeper, a rhythm that matched the great heartbeat of the world itself. The chalice began to fill with water that seemed to spring from nowhere, crystal clear and reflecting depths that held no bottom. Ember lowered his muzzle to drink, and the moment his lips touched the surface, everything changed. The chamber walls dissolved, replaced by visions that swept through Kyle's mind like a rushing tide. He saw the world as it had been in the beginning, young and wild, populated by creatures of myth and wonder. Dragons soared through crystalline skies, while unicorns danced in meadows of starlight. Magic flowed like rivers through every living thing, binding all creation in an endless web of possibility. Then came the darkness, not evil, but entropy. The slow fading of wonder as mortals forgot how to see beyond the veil of the ordinary. The creatures of legend retreated to hidden places, their power diminishing with each passing generation. The world grew smaller, grayer, as imagination gave way to mere survival. But the vision didn't end in despair. Instead, Kyle witnessed the careful preservation of hope. The guardians who had maintained the old ways, the bloodlines kept pure through centuries of patient waiting, the ancient sites protected from those who would desecrate them. And, at the heart of it all, the promise of return, embodied in the humblest of vessels. When the visions faded, Ember stood transformed once more. His coat now bore patterns of deep emerald that seemed to shift and flow like living vines. His eyes held depths that spoke of ancient wisdom, of connection to every stone and stream, every root and branch that comprised the living world. "You understand now," Kyle said, though he wasn't certain if he spoke to Ember or to himself. "The power isn't about dominion over the earth, it's about becoming one with it." A new passage had opened in the far wall, marked with symbols that glowed with gentle blue fire. The trial of spirit awaited beyond, but Kyle found himself hesitating. Each transformation brought Ember closer to his ultimate destiny, but it also carried him further from the simple creature the old man had first chosen. There was sadness in that progression, even as there was wonder. Ember turned back to him with eyes full of understanding and something that might have been gratitude. The donkey, though that word no longer seemed adequate, nuzzled against Kyle's weathered cheek with surprising gentleness. "Yes," Kyle murmured, drawing strength from that simple contact. "I know. The choice was made long ago, wasn't it, before either of us understood what it would mean." Together they stepped through the glowing archway and into the blue-lit passage beyond. The sound of their footsteps changed, becoming lighter, more musical, as if the very stones sang beneath them. Somewhere ahead lay the next trial, and beyond that, a destiny that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the possible. The ancient temple crumbled around them as Elias pressed his palm against the crystalline heart embedded in the altar. Power coursed through the stone channels carved into the walls, awakening something that had slumbered for millennia. The air itself seemed to thicken with magic, and Seren felt her small hooves begin to glow with the same ethereal light that had marked her transformation. "The old ways are returning," whispered Kalen, his weathered face illuminated by the growing radiance. "Can you feel it, child? The barriers between worlds grow thin." But their moment of wonder shattered as the ground beneath them began to crack. Through the fissures seeped a darkness so absolute it seemed to devour light itself. Valdris had found them. "Run," Elias commanded, though his voice carried no panic, only grim determination. "The awakening cannot be stopped now, but we must reach the convergence before he corrupts the flow." They burst from the collapsing temple into a world transformed. The sky churned with unnatural colors, deep purples bleeding into molten gold, while stars flickered into existence despite the daylight. In the distance, the village of Millbrook wavered like a mirage, its simple cottages flickering between their humble reality and something far grander. Seren's hooves barely touched the ground as she ran. The magic flowing through the ancient channels had awakened something primal within her, and she found herself moving with impossible grace and speed. Behind them, the temple's destruction sent shock waves through the earth, but ahead lay their destination, a circle of standing stones that predated even the oldest human settlements. "The convergence of Athros," Kalen gasped as they crested a hill. Below them, 7 towering monoliths formed a perfect circle, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the uncertain light. Here, where the first compact was made between our kinds, but they were not alone. Valdris stood at the circle's center, his form wreathed in shadow that moved independently of the wind. Around him, the air itself seemed wounded, reality bleeding at the edges where his presence touched it. "You have done well to come this far," the dark figure called, his voice echoing strangely among the stones. "But you misunderstand the nature of power, old man. The ancient ways failed for good reason." Elias stepped forward, his hand resting on Seren's neck. She could feel his trembling, not from fear, but from the enormous effort of channeling forces beyond mortal comprehension. The compact was not a failure, Valdris. It was a choice, a recognition that true strength comes from unity, not dominion. Pretty words from a dying age. Valdris raised his hand, and the shadows around him coalesced into writhing tendrils. But observe how easily such unity shatters. The attack came not as physical force, but as pure negation, a wave of darkness that sought to unmake rather than destroy. Seren felt it wash over her like ice water, trying to convince her very essence that she had never existed at all. But the magic flowing through her rebelled against this erasure, and she blazed with silver light that drove the shadows back. "Impossible," Valdris snarled. "You are nothing, a failed creature chosen by sentiment and weakness." "No." Seren spoke for the first time since entering the temple, her voice clear and strong despite her small form. "I was chosen because I understand what you never could. Strength is not the absence of weakness. It is the choice to continue despite it." The standing stones began to resonate, their ancient symbols flaring to life as Seren stepped into the circle. Each monolith bore the mark of a different covenant: wolf and human, eagle and elf, dragon and dwarf, and others whose peoples had long since faded from memory. At the circle's heart stood the smallest stone, unmarked save for a simple carving of a donkey. "The humble stone," Kalen breathed. "I had thought it legend." Valdris's composure finally cracked. "You cannot mean to invoke the first compact. The cost will be mine to bear," Seren interrupted. She touched her nose to the small stone, and the world exploded into light. Every living thing for miles felt the pulse of magic that erupted from the convergence. In Millbrook, the villagers gasped as their simple tools transformed into implements of impossible craftsmanship. Withered crops burst into abundant bloom, while the sick found their ailments simply gone. But Seren felt herself changing too, not growing larger or stronger, but somehow becoming more than she had been. The magic of the compact flowed through her, binding her to every creature that had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or deemed worthless. Valdris screamed as the shadows around him dissolved, not destroyed but transformed into something gentler. Even he, in his arrogance and hatred, was still part of the great tapestry of existence. "The choosing is complete," Elias said softly, tears streaming down his face. "And the world shall remember what it means to value the small and forgotten." The ancient chamber beneath the Temple of Echoes pulsed with ethereal light as Kieran placed his weathered hands upon the crystalline altar. Zara stood beside him, her coat now gleaming with threads of silver that seemed to capture and reflect the mystical energies swirling around them. The village elders who had followed them into the depths watched in reverent silence, their earlier doubts dissolved by the miraculous transformations they had witnessed. "The final awakening requires sacrifice," Kieran said, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge, passed down through generations. "Not of life, but of the old ways. The barriers between realms have grown thin, and what emerges from this moment will reshape everything you have known." Elder Matthias stepped forward, his face pale in the crystalline glow. "What kind of sacrifice? What must we give up?" Before Kieran could answer, the chamber trembled. Dust cascaded from the ancient stone ceiling as a deep rumbling echoed from somewhere far below. Zara's horn blazed brighter, responding to the disturbance with protective radiance. "They come," Kieran whispered, his eyes distant. "The Shadow Court has sensed the awakening. They seek to claim Zara's power before the transformation completes." The villagers pressed closer together as shadows began seeping through the chamber walls like living smoke. These were no ordinary darkness. They writhed and twisted with malevolent intelligence, reaching toward the altar with grasping tendrils. Zara reared back, her horn casting brilliant rays that held the shadows at bay, but Kieran could see the strain in her movements. The awakening had drained much of her strength, and maintaining this barrier against the Shadow Court's advance would exhaust her completely. "The ritual must continue," he declared, pulling a small vial from his robes. The liquid inside swirled with captured starlight. "This contains the last essence of the First Realm, preserved for 1,000 years. When combined with Zara's power and the willing hearts of those who believe, it will create a permanent ward against the darkness." Young Thomas, who had first discovered Zara stumbling and weak in the village square, pushed through the crowd. "Tell us what to do. We won't let them take her." Kieran smiled at the boy's courage. "Each of you must touch the altar and speak aloud what you're willing to release. Your fears, your hatred, your desire for easy answers. These emotions feed the Shadow Court's power. Release them and starve our enemies of their strength." The shadows pressed closer, their whispers filling the chamber with doubt and despair. Some villagers wavered, but Thomas stepped forward first, placing his small hand on the crystal surface. "I release my fear of being too small to matter," the boy said clearly. The crystal flared, and the shadows recoiled slightly. One by one, the villagers followed. Elder Matthias released his fear of change. Maria, the baker's wife, let go of her anger toward those who had mocked her kindness. Each confession weakened the encroaching darkness and strengthened the protective barrier around them. As the final villager spoke their release, Kieran uncorked the vial. The starlight essence rose in a spiraling column, merging with the energy emanating from Zara's horn. The fusion created something entirely new, a warm golden radiance that filled every corner of the chamber. But the Shadow Court made one desperate assault. The darkness surged forward in a massive wave, threatening to overwhelm them all. Zara stumbled under the psychic weight of their attack, her legs buckling. "She can't hold them alone," Kieran shouted over the rising wind that had somehow begun howling through the underground chamber. "Link hands, form a circle around the altar." The villagers joined hands instinctively, their circle encompassing both Zara and Kieran. As their human chain completed, something extraordinary happened. The released emotions, transformed by their willing sacrifice, flowed between them like a river of light. Their combined strength poured into Zara, not just restoring her power but amplifying it beyond anything Kieran had imagined possible. The unicorn's horn erupted with solar brilliance. The golden light expanded outward, racing through the chamber walls, up through the temple above, and spreading across the entire village in a protective dome. Where the light touched the shadows, they dissolved like mist before sunrise. In the aftermath of that blazing moment, the chamber fell silent except for the gentle humming of the crystal altar. The Shadow Court's presence had vanished entirely, banished by the united will of the community. Kieran looked around at the transformed faces of the villagers. Their eyes held new depth, reflecting wisdom earned through trial and sacrifice. They had faced their deepest fears and chosen hope over despair. "The awakening is complete," he announced softly. "But this is not an ending, it's a beginning. The barrier will hold, but beyond these borders, others still suffer under the Shadow Court's influence. Your choice now is whether to remain protected in isolation or to carry this light into the wider world." Zara stepped forward, her horn still glowing softly, and nuzzled young Thomas's shoulder. When the boy looked into her eyes, he saw infinite compassion and unwavering determination. "We go," Thomas said simply, speaking for them all. The dawn light filtered through the crystal spires of the ethereal city, casting rainbow patterns across the marble streets, where Aurelius stood beside his transformed companion. The donkey's silver coat gleamed with an inner radiance, wings folded gracefully against his sides as he gazed upon the assembled council of ancients with newfound wisdom in his luminous eyes. Elder Seraphina stepped forward, her gossamer robes trailing starlight. "The transformation is complete," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of eons. "But the true test lies ahead. The Shadowlands have begun their final advance, and the barrier between worlds grows thin." Aurelius felt the familiar ache in his chest, the burden of his ancient gift pressing down upon him like a stone. For centuries, he had walked among mortals, selecting and guiding, but never before had the stakes been so dire. The prophecy spoke of a union between the humble and the divine, a bridge that could span the growing chasm between light and shadow. "The villagers below remain unaware," he said, watching as dark clouds gathered on the horizon beyond the city's protective dome. "They see only what they wish to see, a stranger and his beast." The donkey, whose true name had been revealed as Luminos during the awakening ceremony, stepped closer to his companion. When he spoke, his voice carried the music of wind chimes and distant bells. They will understand when the time comes. Fear has clouded their vision, but love will clear it. Seraphina nodded gravely. The Shadow King has already begun his assault on the outer realms. 3 villages have fallen to despair, their inhabitants consumed by hopelessness. You must return before the darkness reaches your own people. Through the transparent walls of the council chamber, they could see the war raging in the distance. Creatures of living shadow clashed against beings of pure light, their battle casting alternating waves of darkness and brilliance across the sky. Each time the shadows advanced, another star seemed to dim in the firmament above. The gift you carry, Aurelius, Elder Seraphina continued, was never meant for you alone. It must be shared, passed on to those who can continue the work when your time ends. The weight of understanding settled upon him. For so long he had borne his burden in solitude, believing that his immortal nature made him the only suitable guardian of such power. But immortality itself might be the very thing that limited his effectiveness. Mortals possessed something he had forgotten, the urgency that came with finite time, the fierce love born of knowing that every moment was precious. Luminos spread his wings, testing their span in the vast chamber. The young girl who showed me kindness, Mira. She has the spark within her. Aurelius remembered the child who had offered water to the pitiful donkey Foal, asking nothing in return. While the adults had mocked and dismissed, she had seen through to the soul beneath the humble exterior. Her heart is pure, but she is so young. Age matters little to the gift, Seraphina reminded him. You know this. How old were you when it first manifested? The memory came flooding back. A boy of 12 summers weeping over a dying bird, wishing desperately that he could take away its pain. The moment when that wish became reality, when the power flowed through him for the first time, had changed everything. The bird had lived, but the boy he had been had died that day, replaced by something larger and lonelier than any child should become. The ritual of transference is dangerous, he said quietly. If she cannot contain the power, then she will die, and the gift will seek another host, Seraphina finished bluntly. But if she succeeds, she will become what you have always been, a guardian of hope in a world too quick to embrace despair. Thunder rolled across the sky as the shadow army pressed closer to the city's defenses. The protective dome flickered momentarily, and several of the council members exchanged worried glances. We're out of time, Luminos said, his voice urgent. The barrier won't hold much longer. We must go now, while the path home remains open. Aurelius closed his eyes and reached out with his consciousness, feeling for the threads that connected him to the mortal realm below. The village where his journey had begun called to him, but something was wrong. The usual warm glow of human emotion had dimmed to barely a flicker. They're losing hope, he whispered, opening his eyes to find Seraphina watching him with ancient compassion. Then you know what must be done. The choice is before you, old friend. Keep the gift and watch the world fall to shadow, or trust in the bonds you've forged and let others carry the light forward. Without another word, Aurelius climbed onto Luminos's back, feeling the familiar comfort of his companion's strength beneath him. The great wings unfurled, and together they launched themselves from the crystal spire, diving through the protective dome toward the darkening world below. The crimson sky above the Shadowlands pulsed with malevolent energy as Lyra stood before the towering obsidian gates of Malakar's fortress. The ancient donkey's silver coat now blazed with ethereal light, each strand of her mane flowing like liquid starfire. The transformation that had begun weeks ago was complete. She was no longer merely a beast of burden, but the legendary guardian reborn. Beside her, Kael gripped his father's sword, its blade humming with the same celestial power that coursed through Lyra's veins. The mysterious stranger, who had first seen Lyra's potential, now revealed himself in his true form, Aldrich, the last of the Star Weavers, his weathered face etched with millennia of waiting for this moment. The final seal lies beyond those gates, Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of ages. Once broken, Malakar will have enough power to tear the veil between worlds. We cannot allow that darkness to consume everything we hold dear. The fortress loomed before them like a cancer against the bleeding sky. Twisted spires reached upward like grasping claws, and the very air around the structure seemed to writhe with shadow. From within came the sound of chanting, dozens of voices raised in a harmony that made the earth beneath their feet tremble with dread. Lyra pawed the ground, leaving glowing hoofprints in the cursed soil. Through their bond, Kyle felt her determination, her complete absence of the fear that had once defined her existence. The pitiful creature who had cowered from village children was gone forever, replaced by something magnificent and terrible in its power. "I can sense the other guardians," Lyra spoke, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the stars themselves. "They're trapped within the fortress, their essence being drained to fuel Malakar's ritual. We must reach them before—" Her words were cut short as the obsidian gates exploded outward. A wave of shadow wraiths poured forth like a plague of locusts, their piercing shrieks filling the air. Behind them strode creatures of living darkness, their forms shifting and writhing as they advanced. Kyle raised his sword, its blade cutting through the first wave of wraiths like a beacon through fog. Each strike dispersed their forms back into the nothingness from which they came. But for every one destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. Aldrich's hands wove intricate patterns in the air, creating barriers of golden light that held back the larger shadow beasts. But it was Lyra who truly turned the tide. She reared up on her hind legs, and from her horn erupted a beam of pure starlight that carved through the enemy ranks like a divine sword. Where the light touched, the corrupted earth began to heal, grass sprouting green and clean in defiance of the surrounding desolation. They fought their way through the courtyard, past fountains that ran black with corrupted water and statues that wept tears of shadow. The fortress itself seemed alive, its walls shifting and changing to confuse their path, but Lyra's inner compass remained true. She could feel the pull of her fellow guardians, their pain calling to her across the dimensions. Inside the fortress, the passages were lit by an eerie phosphorescence that seemed to drain warmth from the air. Portraits on the walls depicted scenes of conquest and destruction, their subjects' eyes following the trio as they passed. Several times they encountered Malakar's servants, twisted beings that had once been human but had surrendered their souls in exchange for dark power. Each battle left them more drained, but also more determined. Kyle's connection to Lyra grew stronger with every step, their minds becoming so synchronized that they moved as one entity. Aldrich's magic provided support and guidance, but the old Star Weaver was clearly struggling against the oppressive atmosphere of the fortress. Finally, they reached the central chamber where the ritual was taking place. The vast circular room rose up into darkness, its walls lined with crystalline prisons that held the captured guardians. A majestic eagle with feathers of liquid gold, a wolf whose fur sparkled like diamond dust, a serpent whose scales held the depths of the ocean, all hung suspended in magical bonds, their life force being slowly siphoned away. At the center of the chamber stood Malakar himself. The sorcerer had abandoned any pretense of humanity, his form now a writhing mass of shadow and malice, held together by will alone. In his hands he held the Heart of Shadows, a crystalline artifact that pulsed with stolen light. "You're too late," Malakar's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "The final Guardian's power flows into me even now. Soon I will have enough strength to remake this world in my image, to rule over a realm where hope itself is forgotten." Lyra stepped forward, her horn blazing brighter than ever before. "Then you understand nothing of what true power means," she replied. "It was never about strength. It was always about connection, about the bonds that unite all living things. The final battle was about to begin." The crystalline walls of the sanctuary trembled as waves of ancient power rippled through the air. Zephyr stood motionless in the center of the vast chamber, his silver coat now blazing with ethereal light that seemed to come from within his very bones. The transformation had begun, and there was no turning back. Ilara pressed her hand against the smooth stone wall, feeling the vibrations travel through her body like a heartbeat. The legends spoke of this moment, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising hum that filled the space, when the chosen would accept their true nature. Jorik stepped closer to the donkey, his weathered face etched with wonder and concern. "Zephyr, lad, can you hear us?" The donkey's eyes opened, revealing irises that swirled with starlight. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions at once. "I hear everything, old friend. The whispers of the wind, the songs of distant stars, the cries of our people still trapped in shadow." He turned his luminous gaze toward the entrance, where darkness pressed against the barrier of light. "And I hear him coming." As if summoned by those words, the temperature in the sanctuary plummeted. Frost began forming on the walls, despite the magical warmth that had protected this place for millennia. Beyond the threshold, a figure materialized from the writhing shadows, tall, draped in robes that seemed to devour light itself, with eyes like burning coals set deep in a face that had once been human. "Malakah," Ilara breathed, her hand instinctively moving to the pendant at her throat. The shadow weaver stepped into the sanctuary, and where his feet touched the sacred ground, the stone cracked and blackened. "So the prophecy reaches its crescendo at last," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "The pitiful creature finally embraces what it was meant to become. But you're too late, Star-Bearer. My armies have already consumed half the realm." Zephyr stepped forward, his hooves striking the ground with sounds like distant thunder. With each step, flowers of pure light bloomed beneath him, pushing back the creeping darkness. "You speak of armies, Malakah, but you've forgotten the most important truth. Darkness exists only in the absence of light." "Brave words from a donkey," Malakah sneered, raising his hands. Shadow fire erupted from his palms, racing toward Zephyr in tendrils of pure malevolence. But Zephyr didn't flinch. Instead, he opened his mouth and sang, a sound unlike anything that had ever emerged from mortal throat. It was the song of creation itself, the melody that had shaped the first stars and breathed life into the void. The shadow fire struck the wall of his song and simply ceased to exist, unraveled at its most fundamental level. Malakah staggered backward, genuine surprise flickering across his ancient features. Impossible. The star song was lost when the first ones departed. "Nothing is ever truly lost," Zephyr replied, his form beginning to shift and expand. Wings of gossamer light unfurled from his shoulders, and a spiral horn of crystallized starlight emerged from his forehead. "It simply waits for the right voice to give it form again." Ilara gasped as understanding flooded through her. "You're not just the star-bearer. You're the last of them, the last of the first ones bound into mortal form." Zephyr nodded, his transformation nearly complete. "I chose to remain when my kin departed, knowing that one day the darkness would return. I allowed myself to be diminished, to forget, to become the least among mortals, so that when the time came, I could remember what it means to choose light over shadow." Malakah's composure cracked entirely. "No, I will not be denied again." He drew power from the shadows beyond the sanctuary, pulling darkness from across the realm. The very air began to writhe as he shaped it into weapons of pure entropy. But Jorik stepped forward, his simple blacksmith's hammer glowing with newfound purpose. "Aye, and I choose to stand with him, as I always have." Behind him, Ilara raised her pendant, its light joining with Zephyr's radiance. "And we choose to stand together," Ilara declared. "All of us, the lost, the forgotten, the ones who never gave up hope." Through the sanctuary's walls, they could see lights beginning to appear across the darkened realm. In every village, in every hidden refuge, those who had kept faith were stepping forward, adding their own small flames to the growing constellation of resistance. Zephyr spread his wings wide, and his song grew stronger, harmonized now by thousands of voices raised in defiant hope. "You sought to rule through fear, Malakah, but you never understood that hope shared becomes unbreakable." The Shadow Weaver raised his hands for one final assault, drawing every shadow in the realm toward this moment. But as he did, Zephyr's song reached its crescendo, and the true battle for the soul of their world began in earnest. The golden light that had engulfed Ember began to fade, revealing something that made the assembled crowd gasp in unison. Where the small, limping donkey had stood moments before, now stood a creature of legend, a magnificent unicorn whose pearl-white coat shimmered with an inner radiance. Her horns, spiraling like polished moonstone, caught the morning sun and scattered rainbow fragments across the village square. Theron stepped back, his weathered face breaking into a smile of profound satisfaction. "The ancient bloodline awakens," he whispered, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "As it was prophesied, so it has come to pass." Ember, for she was still Ember, despite her transformation, looked down at herself with wonder. The twisted leg that had caused her so much pain was now straight and strong. Her breathing came easily, no longer labored. Most startling of all was the sensation coursing through her being, as if starlight flowed through her veins instead of blood. Young Willem pushed through the crowd, his eyes wide with amazement and something deeper, recognition. "I knew," he breathed, reaching out tentatively toward her muzzle. "I always knew you were special." As his small hand touched her coat, a gentle warmth spread from the contact point. Willem's chronic cough, which had plagued him since birth, simply ceased. His mother, standing nearby, let out a strangled cry of joy as she realized what had happened. "The healing gift," Theron explained, his voice heavy with reverence. "The last unicorn's greatest blessing, but this is only the beginning of what she can do." The crowd pressed closer, and Ember felt their hopes and needs washing over her like waves. Old Henrik with his failing eyesight, Sarah with her withered arm, young Thomas whose fever had burned for weeks. She could sense them all, could feel the pull of their suffering calling to something deep within her transformed nature. But before she could respond to these calls, a sound made everyone freeze, the thunderous approach of many hooves. Captain Voss and his soldiers crested the hill overlooking the village, their armor gleaming menacingly in the sunlight. Behind them rode a figure that made Theron's expression darken. Lord Malric himself, clad in black armor and carrying an obsidian staff that seemed to absorb light. "Stand aside," Voss bellowed as the soldiers surrounded the square. "By order of Lord Malric, that creature is to be captured immediately." Malric urged his destrier forward, his eyes fixed on Ember with a hunger that made her skin crawl. "So the old fool actually did it," he said, his voice silk over steel. "Awakened the bloodline. No matter, a unicorn's horn holds enough power to fuel my spells for a century. You will not touch her." Willem stepped protectively in front of Ember, his small frame dwarfed by the approaching soldiers. Malric laughed coldly. "A child thinks to stand against me, seize the beast." But as the soldiers moved forward, Theron raised his staff, and ancient words of power rolled from his tongue. A barrier of silver light sprang up around Ember and the villagers, causing the soldiers' weapons to ring harmlessly against its surface. "Your magic is old and weak, wizard," Malric snarled, raising his obsidian staff. Dark energy crackled around its tip. "Mine draws from deeper wells." He unleashed a bolt of shadow that struck Theron's barrier with tremendous force. The old wizard staggered, his face paling with the effort of maintaining the shield. Cracks appeared in the silver light. "I cannot hold this much longer," Theron gasped. "Ember, you must choose. Flee now, or stay and fight. But know that if you stay, there will be no turning back. You will be committed to the path your bloodline was meant to walk." Ember looked around at the faces of the villagers, people who had mocked her, yes, but also those who had shown her kindness. Willem, who had believed in her when no one else would. His mother, who had given her shelter. Even some who had scorned her before now looked at her with desperate hope. Another blast from Malric's staff sent spiderweb fractures racing across Theron's barrier. The old wizard fell to one knee, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Ember made her choice. She stepped forward, her horn beginning to glow with pure white light. The power within her, dormant for so long, finally found its voice. When she spoke, it was not in the braying voice of a donkey, but in tones like crystal bells and running water. "I am Ember, last daughter of the Silver Line, keeper of the ancient covenant. I will not flee from darkness when light is needed." Her horn blazed like a star, and the very air around her began to sing with power. Malric's eyes widened as he realized what he truly faced, not a frightened animal to be captured, but a guardian awakened, ready to defend what she held dear. The final confrontation was about to begin. The dawn broke over Millhaven with a light unlike any the villagers had ever seen. It wasn't the harsh glare of battle or the supernatural radiance of magic, but something softer, the warm, golden glow of hope fulfilled. Arya stood at the village center, no longer the scrawny, limping foal who had been deemed worthless by all except one mysterious stranger. Her coat gleamed like starlight, her wings spread wide enough to cast protective shadows over the gathered crowd, and her horn caught the morning sun like a beacon. Elias approached slowly, his weathered face creased with wonder. The ancient stranger who had seen potential where others saw only pity now looked every one of his countless years, but his eyes sparkled with profound satisfaction. He placed a gentle hand on Arya's neck, and she lowered her magnificent head to nuzzle his shoulder with the same affection she had shown him as a frightened foal. "The prophecy spoke true," he murmured, his voice carrying across the silent square. "Not the strongest, nor the most beautiful, but the one with the purest heart would become the bridge between worlds." The villagers who had once laughed at his choice now stood in reverent silence. Thomas the miller stepped forward first, his cap clutched in his hands. We were wrong about her. About you. Can you forgive us?" Elias smiled, the expression transforming his lined features. "There is nothing to forgive. You saw what your eyes told you to see. But Arya saw deeper than that, didn't you, my dear one?" The alicorn's response was a melodic sound that seemed to harmonize with the very air itself. Where her hooves touched the ground, tiny flowers bloomed in perfect circles, spreading outward in ripples of new life. The withered fields beyond the village, scarred by the recent battle with the shadow beasts, began to shimmer with returning vitality. Young Sarah ran forward, the same child who had been among the first to show Arya kindness despite her appearance. "Will she stay with us?" Elias exchanged a long look with Arya, a conversation passing between them in silence. Finally he nodded. "She will stay as long as she chooses to stay, but know this, she is no longer just your village's guardian. She has awakened to her true nature, and others will come seeking her wisdom and protection." As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the forest paths and distant roads. Word of the transformation had already begun to spread through means both magical and mundane. Travelers, scholars, and pilgrims approached with wonder-filled faces, drawn by the legend that had finally come to pass. Among them came other magical beings, creatures of forest and stream who had hidden themselves away during the long age of shadow. They approached Arya with deep bows and musical greetings in languages older than human memory. A delegation of unicorns emerged from the deepest part of the Whispering Woods, their own horns glowing in recognition of their transformed cousin. But perhaps most remarkably, a group of donkeys and mules made their way into the village square. They moved with new dignity, their heads held high, for they too were forever changed by what Arya had become. No longer would their kind be dismissed as mere beasts of burden. They carried within them the potential for greatness, and everyone could see it now. Old Henrik, the village's harshest critic of Elias's choice, approached with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I called her worthless," he whispered. "I said she would never amount to anything." Arya turned to him, her luminous eyes holding no trace of resentment. She stepped forward and touched her horn gently to his forehead. In that moment, Henrik's expression transformed as visions flooded his mind, images of all the small kindnesses he had forgotten, all the moments when he had chosen compassion over judgment, all the good that had always existed within his gruff exterior. "She sees not what we were," Elias said softly, "but what we can become." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Bards arrived to compose songs about the donkey who became legend. Artists came to capture her image, but through it all, Arya remained grounded in the simple joy of being loved and loving in return. She played with the village children, helped with the harvest that grew miraculously abundant, and each evening she would walk through Millhaven's streets, bringing comfort to anyone in need. As the sun set on that 3rd day, Elias prepared to take his leave. His work here was finished, though new adventures awaited beyond the horizon. Arya would no longer need his guidance. She had found her purpose and her place in the world. "Will we see you again?" asked the village elder. Elias shouldered his traveling pack, looking every inch the wandering stranger who had first arrived among them. "Perhaps. When the next seemingly impossible choice needs to be made, when someone else sees potential where others see only problems." He smiled. After all, there are always more legends waiting to be born. He walked away as quietly as he had come, leaving behind a village forever changed, and a legend that would inspire generations to see beyond the surface to the extraordinary possibilities that dwell within the ordinary world.